We are less than 2 weeks out from the first results of the 2024 presidential race. In today's video, I'm going to take you through my latest predictions for every state on the map, hour by hour, just as you will experience the calls being made on election night. That means I'll also give you my predictions for when the decision desks will be able to make those projections throughout the night, and unfortunately, over the next few days as well. Let's start with our first poll closing at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Polls will close in 6 states: Vermont, Indiana, Kentucky, Virginia, South Carolina, and Georgia. Indiana and Kentucky are solid for former President Donald Trump. He carried Indiana by 16 points in 2020 and Kentucky by 25, so I expect both to be called by most networks as soon as polls close. Trump is also expected to win South Carolina by a double-digit margin. While not as deep red as some other southern states, Trump won it by about 12 points in 2020. And it hasn't gone blue since 1976. While it may not be called at the exact closing time, it should be within about 15 minutes. For Vice President Kamala Harris, Vermont is a lock. This was the bluest state in the country in 2020 with a Biden margin of plus 35. As for Virginia and Georgia, those are more competitive and won't be called immediately. Both will go in the too close to call category as the night begins. Next up, at 7:30 p.m., polls will close in Ohio, West Virginia, and North Carolina. West Virginia will be called immediately for Trump as it continues to be one of the most Republican-leaning states in the country. Trump won West Virginia by 40 points in the last election, so there's no question about the outcome here. For Ohio and North Carolina, however, it will be too early to call when the precincts close. Ohio might be called earlier than it has been in decades. Trump won the state by 8 percentage points in both 2016 and 2020, and polling has him ahead by about the same margin right now. Still, it will be marked too close to call for the moment. North Carolina is a key battleground, like Georgia, where the race could be decided by just a couple of points or even less. Don't expect a call for at least an hour or two, possibly longer depending on that margin. That being said, it is worth noting that both North Carolina and Georgia tend to count their votes more quickly compared to other battlegrounds, and they'll have a head start. I expect them to be the first 2 core battlegrounds to be called. For your reference, those other battlegrounds are Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, and then Arizona and Nevada. These latter 2 will be the slowest, but we'll get to that later on. Next, we head into the 8 o'clock poll closings, which will be the largest of the entire night, accounting for over 170 combined electoral votes. This includes nearly the entire Northeast outside of New York, with the key battleground state of Pennsylvania, a state that might be the single most important one on the map. Also closing at this hour are Illinois in the Midwest and several southern states, including Tennessee, Alabama, Florida, Mississippi, Missouri, and Oklahoma. We can immediately place most of these northeastern states in the safe column for Harris, Washington, D.C., Maryland, Delaware, New Jersey, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and Maine's 1st Congressional District. However, Maine's statewide race and the 2nd District will both go in the too close to call column, along with New Hampshire. One key thing to watch in Maine is if neither Trump nor Harris hits the 50% threshold. If that happens, the state will use ranked choice voting to eliminate third-party candidates and redistribute their second-choice votes until someone reaches 50%. I fully expect Harris to win statewide and Trump to carry the 2nd District. But if they don't clear that 50% threshold, networks might need to hold off on calling the race. As for New Hampshire, it should be called relatively quickly on election night, but still likely not until at least an hour after polls close, even if Harris wins by about 7 points, similar to Biden's margin in 2020 and how she's polling right now. Democrats have carried Illinois by at least 10 points in every election since 1988, and while there may be slight rightward trends in major cities like Chicago, it won't be enough to tighten the margin significantly. As for Trump, he should easily carry several southern states: Oklahoma, Missouri, Tennessee, Mississippi, and Alabama, along with Florida. That's right, I expect Florida to be called as soon as the polls close statewide at 8 p.m. That's because most of the state actually closes its doors at 7, except for just a few counties here in the Panhandle. Florida is also one of the fastest counting states in the country, as a lot of Floridians vote early, and state law allows for them to count those votes prior to Election Day, meaning we should have at least 70% in by 8 p.m. And considering that Trump is expected to carry Florida by the widest margin for a presidential candidate in decades, that makes it very likely that at least one decision desk will call the race in his favor by then. Trump currently leads Harris by more than 8 points in the real clear polling average, with 2 of the 5 surveys included in this average showing him up by double digits. So taking a look back at the map after the 8 o'clock poll closings, Trump leads with 105 electoral votes, while Harris has 75. There are still 88 votes distributed across states that are too close to call at this point. Our next poll closing comes at 8:30, with Arkansas being the only state where polls will close, and it will be called instantly for Trump. He carried Arkansas by 28 points in 2020, so we can expect a quick projection here. Now, between the 8:30 and 9 o'clock poll closings, I anticipate we might get a call in Ohio. Typically, Democrats jump out to an early lead there due to early and absentee votes out of urban areas reporting first. But Republicans close the gap and take over as the Election Day votes are tallied. It's just a matter of when Trump will overtake Harris in the count, and once he does, he's expected to expand that lead. Trump won Ohio by 8 points in 2020 and leads by 7% right now in the 2024 poll average. So let's go ahead and add Ohio's 17 electoral votes to Trump's tally now. I also think we should get a call for Harris in New Hampshire sometime between 8:30 to 9. 4 electoral votes will be added to the vice president's tally here, as New Hampshire is likely to back Harris by a similar margin as it did for Biden in 2020, around 7 points. Now that brings us to our 9 p.m. closing, the second largest closing of the night. I call this battleground Central Time, as the polls close in Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, Colorado, New Mexico, Texas, and Arizona. Each of these states were decided by 10 points or less in 2020. The polls will also close in several less competitive states here across the middle of the country, and of course in New York. In total, we're looking at 163 electoral votes in play. For Trump, we should see immediate calls in several states right at 9 p.m. North and South Dakota, Wyoming, Nebraska's statewide race, and its 1st and 3rd congressional districts. The 2nd district will be too close to call at that moment, but more on that later. Kansas and Louisiana are also solid Trump states. Iowa is likely to be called for Trump soon after polls close, similar to Ohio. It shifted heavily to the right in 2016 and 2020, and Trump is expected to win by a similar margin this year. It may be too close to call right at poll closing, but I expect it to be called within the next hour before the 10 p.m. closing. For Harris, on the other hand, I expect New York to be tallied up for her right at 9 p.m. While it may trend slightly right like Illinois, and Harris may not reach Biden's 23-point margin from 2020, I still don't expect it to get anywhere near single digits. As for the rest of the battlegrounds, they'll be too close to call when polls close, but we should get a few calls within the hour. In Colorado, for example, the state votes almost entirely by mail, and we usually see a large drop of votes shortly after polls close, which could lead to a quick call for Harris. Colorado is the fastest left-trending state in the country, and Biden won it by nearly 14 points in 2020. I also expect a call for Harris in New Mexico between 9 and 10 p.m. It voted for Biden by 11 points in 2020, and the polls currently show Harris leading by a narrower yet still comfortable 7.7% over the last 3 polls. The rest of the too close to call states will likely remain in that category until after 10 p.m. If we look back at some of the early closing states, like Virginia, it's kind of a flipped scenario to what happens in Ohio, where Republicans tend to lead early, but Democrats catch up as votes from the Northern Virginia suburbs come in later. Those suburban areas around D.C. are heavily Democratic and typically push the Democrats ahead. I expect Harris to carry Virginia by around 4 to 6 points, but it may be difficult to call the state this early in the night. As for North Carolina and Georgia, they might be getting closer to a call by this point, depending on the margins. If Trump is set to win both states by more than a point, we might even see a call before 10 p.m., but that's likely a bit optimistic. We'll probably have to wait until after the 10 p.m. poll closings. On that note, at 10 p.m., that's when polls close in Montana, Utah, and Nevada. Montana and Utah should be instantly called for Trump, as both states are solidly Republican. Nevada, on the other hand, is one of the core battlegrounds and could end up being the last state called in the entire election. Nevada is known for its slow ballot processing, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's not called until Friday. In fact, that's probably a very reasonable estimate, especially since Nevada is likely to be decided by a razor-thin margin. Between 10 p.m. and 11 p.m. on election night is when we'll likely start seeing some of the more competitive states get called. I expect Virginia to be called for Harris around this time. Although Joe Biden won Virginia by 10 points in 2020, this year's race is shaping up to be much closer. Before Trump dropped out, polls had shown him leading Biden in the Real Clear Politics average. Now, with Harris as the nominee, she leads Trump by an average of 6.4 points across the last 5 polls. While Harris is underperforming Biden's 2020 margin, I don't have any serious doubt about her chances of winning Virginia by this point in the night. We should also get a call-up in Maine around this time. I expect Harris to win the statewide contest, while Trump will likely carry Maine's 2nd congressional district. Biden won Maine by 9 points in 2020, and Harris has maintained at least that margin in every poll during this cycle. With RFK Jr. no longer in the race, the risk of third-party candidates pulling away votes and dipping her below 50% is minimal. Likewise, Trump is expected to hold Maine's 2nd district, which he carried in both 2016 and 2020, most recently by 7 points. I think we should also get a call for Harris in Nebraska's 2nd district and in her running mate Tim Walz's home state of Minnesota during this period. Votes are counted here much faster than in the other competitive Rust Belt states, and the margin won't be as close either. Biden won Minnesota by 7 points in 2020, and right now, Harris leads by an average of 4.7% based on the latest 4 polls. Democrats also tend to jump out to an early lead here, which should make it easier to call the race early, since the decision desks won't need to wait for a late surge to pull them ahead. The final call I feel comfortable making right now is down in Texas, the 2nd largest prize on the map with 40 electoral votes. Most of Texas closes at 8 p.m., except for El Paso out in the southwest corner. Texas is also known for reporting its early vote quickly. I don't expect Trump's margin to shrink much compared to 2020 when he carried the state by 5.5 points. Right now, he's leading by a slightly larger 6% based on the last 5 polls, which all show him up by 5 or 7 points. So Texas goes into the Republican column, pushing Trump's total to 212 electoral votes ahead of Harris's 148. Alrighty, now by 11 o'clock Eastern Time, this is what I expect the map to look like. The only states left in the too close to call column are the 7 key battlegrounds we've been discussing throughout the cycle: Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania in the upper Rust Belt, along with North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada. Assuming things go according to plan and the margins are all roughly similar across all 7 states, then we should see calls for both Georgia and North Carolina by midnight. Michigan and Wisconsin will likely be called between 1 a.m. and 4 a.m. on Wednesday, while Pennsylvania probably won't be decided until Wednesday afternoon. As for Arizona and Nevada, those likely won't be called until Thursday or Friday, similar to what we saw during the 2022 midterms. I'll dive into the implications of all of that in a moment, but first, let's focus on the 11 p.m. states: Idaho, Washington, Oregon, and California. Trump will easily win Idaho, while Harris is expected to sweep the Pacific Coast states, keeping them blue for the 9th consecutive cycle. That includes her home state of California, the largest prize on the map, with 54 electoral votes. This pushes her total ahead of Trump's, giving her 222 electoral votes to the Republicans' 216. Now, just two states remain open, Alaska and Hawaii, which will close at midnight Eastern Time. At this point in the night, the big question on everyone's mind will be how quickly either candidate can reach that crucial 270 electoral vote mark and secure the presidency. So let's break it down together. The first battlegrounds likely to be called are Georgia and North Carolina. Based on the current data, I believe Trump has the edge in both states. In Georgia, he's leading by an average of 2.5 points across the last 8 polls, while in North Carolina, his lead is tighter, standing at 0.4% over the last 9 polls. Beyond the polls, BetOnline's prediction markets also favor Trump. He's favored with minus 270 odds in Georgia, roughly translating to a 70 to 75% chance of winning. Likewise, in North Carolina, Trump's odds sit at a similar minus 250. These aren't just static numbers from outdated polls, they're dynamic, real-time reflections of public sentiment adjusting constantly as new information comes in. So, all signs point to Trump having an advantage in these two states at this stage. In 2020, Georgia voted for Biden by just 0.2%, the narrowest margin of any state in that election. This victory was largely driven by high turnout among black voters, especially in Atlanta, one of the country's fastest growing and diversifying cities. However, in 2024, Trump has made significant gains among black voters. Polling crosstabs show him up nearly 18 points with this demographic compared to 2020. Even if only half those gains actually materialize come Election Day, it could be a decisive factor given how tight the race was in 2020. It's also worth noting Georgia's more religious and socially conservative population relative to other battlegrounds. For all those reasons, I'm placing Georgia in the Republican column for Trump. Now, on to North Carolina. Although it's always competitive, Democrats haven't won a federal election here since 2008. Trump carried North Carolina in 2020 by just over a point, in spite of the final polling average showing Biden in the lead. With that in mind, I'm also putting North Carolina in Trump's column here. Together with Georgia, Trump now sits at 248 electoral votes, 22 shy of 270. There are still 5 key states that remain too close to call, and I don't expect any of them to be decided before midnight, which is when polls close in Alaska and Hawaii. Harris should immediately secure Hawaii. As for Alaska, I fully expect Trump to hold Alaska, but it will be too close to call as polls close. Unfortunately, they do take a while to drop their first votes, and I don't see the networks calling it without any votes in, especially since Trump only carried it by only 10 points in 2020, the narrowest margin for a Republican in decades. Based on past cycles, we should get the first results from Alaska around 2 a.m. But before then, I expect Wisconsin to be called probably between 1 and 2 a.m. For those of you following my channel throughout the cycle, you'll know I've been more skeptical of Kamala Harris's chances in Wisconsin than the general public. She is a demonstrably weaker candidate compared to Biden among older, working-class white voters. Wisconsin is also whiter, more rural, and less college-educated than the other two Rust Belt battlegrounds, meaning another Trump overperformance among the white working class would be especially pronounced here. Wisconsin was the site of the 2 largest polling misses underestimating Trump in 2016 and 2020. He overperformed by 7 points in 2016 and by nearly 8 points in 2020. With that in mind, the polls in Wisconsin just recently flipped to favor Trump for the first time since Harris took over the nomination. She had consistently led throughout August and September, but Trump now leads by 0.4 of a percentage point, on average, over the last 7 surveys. All of these factors lead me to grant Trump the edge here as we place it in his corner. That gets him to 258. Assuming Alaska is called for him soon thereafter, that brings him to 261, meaning Trump would only need to win one of the remaining states, except Nevada, to reach 270 and become the president-elect. That being said, the next most likely state to be called is Michigan, and I have this one going to Harris. Michigan is fundamentally the bluest of the battleground states, with Joe Biden having carried it by 2.8% in 2020. Since then, Democrats have performed strongly down ballot in the state. I expect Michigan to be called around 3 to 4 a.m. on Wednesday as late-night vote dumps from deep blue Detroit come in. That means we'll probably need to wait until Wednesday afternoon to call the presidential race, as that's when I think the networks will feel comfortable enough to call Pennsylvania for Trump. The most likely tipping point state on the map, the Keystone State is worth 19 electoral votes and would lift Trump all the way up to 280 electoral votes. Pennsylvania voted for Trump by 0.7% in 2016 and then flipped back to favor Biden by 1.2% in 2020. Now, here in 2024, the polls have Trump leading by 0.8% over the last 10 polls included in the average. The BetOnline odds, meanwhile, have Trump's odds sitting at minus 150, his best odds in any of the WIMPA states. This leaves us with Arizona and Nevada. I expect Arizona to be called for Trump by Thursday night, as the late arriving absentee ballots here tend to favor Republicans more heavily. Remember, in 2020, Fox News called Arizona too early, not realizing that unlike most states, late arriving ballots in Arizona lean more Republican and narrowed the margin to just 0.3%. While Biden managed to hold on, I don't think Harris will be as fortunate this time. The odds give Trump his best odds here in Arizona out of any of the core battleground states, and his polling advantage sits at almost 2 points right now over the last 7 surveys. As for Nevada, this state may not be called until Friday at the earliest. It may only be worth 6 electoral votes, and therefore really just an afterthought in the race to 270, but it's just as closely contested as other core battlegrounds. In terms of ballot counting, Nevada is sort of the reverse scenario compared to Arizona. Trump will probably lead early on, but the final drops from Clark County, which surrounds Las Vegas, are likely to narrow the gap. The question is whether Harris will have enough juice to get over the top. Right now, it's not trending favorably for her. She trails Trump by almost a full point in the latest average, and the odds have flipped back to Trump at minus 160. Remember, prior to President Biden dropping out of the race, he had trailed Trump by more than 5.5 points. So back on our map, I'll place Nevada back in the Trump column for now, wrapping up this hour-by-hour prediction for election night 2024. Trump is projected to win the race by Wednesday afternoon, ending up with 297 electoral votes to Harris's 241. As always, feel free to let me know in the comments what you think of this map and suggest any other videos or topics you'd like to see in the future. That does it for today's video though. Shout out to my channel members in the description below. Make sure to subscribe to my channel down below and please leave a like on the video if you enjoyed it. You can check out more content from my channel here, and as always, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. EP out.